But all these simultaneous disasters, this is the, Jacob Stern wrote a piece in The Atlantic, and I think it's a good one and a good point. I noticed, the weekend before last, something, I don't even remember what it was, and I snapped at Louise, and she was like, wait a minute, are you feeling grumpy? And I'm like, whoa, yeah, I am. And it's like, and we both were. I mean, it's like, how did this happen? What do we do to fix it? And, we ended up like hugging each other and kind of talking about it. But what I'm figuring out is that I'm suffering, and I think probably everyone is suffering from some sort of, variation on something like post-traumatic stress disorder or present traumatic stress disorder. I mean, for a year, I couldn't see my grandchildren or my children. I couldn't travel. I've traveled my whole entire life. I couldn't be with my best friend, Jerry, who went through back surgery, and then his wife died. He and his wife both got COVID. This is my best friend. I've known, since the early 70s. He lives in New York. In normal circumstances, I would have hopped on a plane, done my show from New York for a few days, and slept on Jerry's couch. Couldn't do it. We have COVID. I'm in almost 2 years, 600,000 dead Americans. I knew people who are now dead from COVID. And, we're heading toward 1 million. In large part because of Republican efforts to play down the virus and discourage people from getting vaccinated simply because they want to try and crash the economy and make things look bad for Joe Biden. And then on top of that, we've got heat waves. It was 116 degrees here this summer. Fires, floods, storms, war. We're pulling out of Afghanistan, and well, now it looks like they're doing a damn good job now. They've got 75,000 people out of Afghanistan so far. But it's a tough time. There will be people left behind. There's no doubt about that. There will be some horrible footage coming out. You bet on it. And then on top of that, I mean, here in Portland, and I know this is happening up and down the West Coast, people who live in areas where winter comes and winter is hard are, in some cases, their cities are providing them with free bus tickets out to the West Coast where the winters are mild. And, so we've got this homeless explosion happening. Had a homeless guy, chase Louise and throw a water bottle at her, go crazy on her. We had a homeless person try to break into our house. I mean, it's like, I've never experienced anything like this. It's nuts. We've got, on top of this, you've got people who are on the verge of becoming homeless because they can't pay rent. They can't get medical care because hospitals are full of COVID. So what do we do about this? Well, I've poured myself into my writing for the last 2 years. I've written 2.5 books, and I edited a third one that on veganism and diet that I want to publish one of these days. But I wrote this book, The Hidden History of American Healthcare, that comes out next week, and I wrote The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, which won't come out until next spring. But it's like I just poured myself into. I started a new project in March, writing a daily newsletter called HartmannReport.com. And, it's like every afternoon, Louise and I spend probably a half hour to an hour figuring out what I'm going to write about. And then I go upstairs in my office and I sit there for 2 or 3 hours and I write the piece. And then in the next morning, I get up at 5 a.m. and I edit it for an hour or so and, publish it. Then go in the office and record the podcast version of it. And it's like, we've gotten busy is the bottom line of all this. My brother, one of my brothers, who is, a computer programmer, has been taking classes, he and his wife, online about how to paint, and he's turned into a pretty good painter. How do you cope with this? And is this messing with our brains? This piece by Jacob Stern over on theatlantic.com, I thought was absolutely fascinating. It was titled "All These Simultaneous Disasters Are Messing with Our Brains." Right? I mean, outside of the generation that both had the flu epidemic of 1918 and fought World War I at the same time, I don't think we've seen anything like this. And pretty much there's nobody alive who was alive back then, or at least alive and old enough to remember it. So this is new to us. And I get it. I'm speaking from a place of incredible privilege. I actually have a house that I live in. I have a good income. I'm an American. Think of the people living in like Syria who have, where Donald Trump stabbed the Kurds in the back and said, okay, you're on your own. And then Turkey came in and started slaughtering them. And ISIS was, and Bashir and the government. I mean, think about, the Afghan refugees that are going to be that are happening right now. They're piling up on the Turkish border, and the Turkish troops are saying, no, you can't come through. They're piling up on I believe it was Tajikistan's border. Somebody called yesterday about that. How do we respond to this? Stephen Taylor, this psychologist who's quoted in this article by Jacob Stern in The Atlantic, talks about how in some cases our response is basically casual sadism. And I remember this. I was in Uganda, up in the Numalo, at the Numalo prison farm, up in the Karamoja region of Uganda. It was these are people who mostly subsist on drinking the milk of the animal. They're herders, right? And when Idi Amin's men went through, they murdered all the men and all the boys who were over maybe 12 years old enough to carry a rifle, and raped all the women. And so by the time we got there a year later, as the famine was really starting to bite, there were all these babies starving. And I remember there was this old Ethiopian priest, and he looked like he was 100 years old. I mean, he was just this little shriveled up guy, this Ethiopian, who was kind of running the place. The Red Cross had left. That's why we went in. Actually it was me and Horst von Heyer, a guy from the Salem organization in Germany. And so we're sitting, and this guy, this old priest had a secret stash in the middle of a famine. I mean, literally people were dying all around us. He had this little secret stash of passion fruit, and they were all shriveled up, these little blackened, shriveled up things, and he cut one open and was doling out to us these little wet, gelatinous seeds that were like, hey, moisture food. And he says, what do you get when you give 5,000 starving people food? And I'm like, I don't know, what do you get? And he goes, 20,000 starving people. And he starts laughing. And it was like, gallows humor. How do you deal with this stuff? And then on top of that, we've got wildfires filling the skies with smoke. We've got earthquakes leveling cities. You've got a disaster in Haiti. You've got buildings collapsing in Florida. Joe Ruzak, a PTSD researcher at Palo Alto, he says, there's a sense that people's coping reserves are kind of finite, and you can diminish your reserves. Now, some people, and this is just like the Kauai study, which I've talked about for years on this program, where they looked at children of great poverty. These were children of migrant farm workers, sugarcane workers on the island of Kauai, Hawaii, where there was basically no escape from the poverty. And what they found was that a larger percentage of those children were highly resilient, even though they were the victims of grinding poverty and terrible abuse. And a higher percentage of them than normal were very fragile. In other words, the middle, okay, I'm sort of resilient and sort of fragile, that middle got much, much narrower, and the two extremes, highly resilient and highly fragile, were exaggerated. I'm guessing that's what's going on. But what do you do? I mean, one of our sponsors, we've got, this sponsor, Annie's Kit Clubs, and, on the commercial side of the show. And they've got a new program that they're advertising on our program, where they're talking about, if you crochet, you can get this kit every month to crochet something, and they have this list of charities, and they give it to people in need. So it's like people are finding ways to kind of reactivate their empathy. I've been finding myself spending a lot more time just like as I'm walking around outside, or even just sitting in the house, just looking up or looking out at a tree or the sky or the skyline or the river or whatever, and saying, wow, thank you, God, for this. Thank you for this life. Going through in my mind the names of people I know as I essentially am saying prayers for them, hoping that each one is getting a little shot of light. I've gotten to where I'm like religiously, no pun intended, doing that every single day. It's like my coping mechanism. How do we deal with this? And how do we deal with the people who want to make it worse because they think it's going to benefit them politically? How do we deal with the rage about that? I mean, when I look at Republicans, and then sometimes there's like, this, is it Schadenfreude, the kind of joy in others' pain? Senator Andre Jacques Depere of Wisconsin. Excuse me, Andre Jacques of Depere, Wisconsin. He's a Republican lawmaker who has spent the last couple months telling people that masks are, a violation of your freedom and vaccines are terrible things. Well, he's on a ventilator now. He's probably going to die. And, part of me wants to say a prayer for him, and part of me is like, hey, I hope a whole lot of people hear about it. It's a tough time.